my name is David Maskeroni. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Aquia. Thank you all again for your time today. I know it's hard for everyone to take an entire day out of your schedule, but I hope it's been worth it so far. I think the morning sessions were really informative. There were a couple things that I learned that I took away that I'm going to talk about real quick. So first of all, in Chris's opening session, I think the point that he made that FedRAMP isn't perfect, but without it, what type of security compliance would anyone be doing? We didn't have any guardrails in place. I think that's something that we should all consider, that this is an evolving thing. We're all part of the solution moving it forward. So that's a key takeaway there. From the agency perspective, Shante had a good analogy of saying, understanding how each agency does their own flavors of ice cream. So if NIST is vanilla, FedRAMP will be chocolate, and then she works at CMS, so CMS would be strawberry. But it's all ice cream. It's just different flavors of it. I thought that was a cool takeaway. For the post-ATO ConMon FedRAMP revision 5, Allie, I was bouncing between the sessions. I think one of the cool questions that Allie received was how data privacy and ConMon interact. So how people actually in their daily work, if they handle sensitive workloads, how is that taken into consideration during continuous monitoring program? And the answer is it's really hard, right? It's on the individual, but it's something that, again, through education and knowledge and just adherence, I think is something that we can all strive to move forward on. On the pre-ATO talk, it was we are all CSPs, according to NIST 800-145. So for those who meet the 5 standards within NIST 800-145, every provider, whether it's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, is considered a cloud solution provider, not just the big 5. I thought that was interesting. I never knew that. In the Vision 2030 session, there was a good question about where humans fit in the context of AI. And it was really about AI as an enabler for people. And the analogy that was given was Starbucks coffee versus your automated airport coffee. If you weren't in that session, we'll explain how you can understand what that means. And then the last one was harnessing GRC. So it's compliance automation versus manual, trying to move away from as much manual as we can so that we can scale the compliance efforts across the board. So if some of those sounded foreign to you and you want to know what I was talking about, we're actually recording all of these sessions. They're going to be on YouTube. I think, where's Ashley? I think it's next week. We're going to have those up so you can see the sessions that you missed. With that, we're going to move into the afternoon program. We have our esteemed panel here. We're going to be talking about navigating the SaaS landscape in the federal government. We have Justin Fanelli, the acting CTO of the Department of Navy, James Saunders, who is the CISO for the Office of OPM, and then Nick Sinai, former U.S. Deputy CTO at the White House, Senior Advisor at Insight Partners, and Adjunct Professor at Kennedy Harbor School, and a Board Advisor for Aquia. For those of you who were paying attention to this program earlier, we were going to have Maria Rote on the program, former Deputy CIO. Unfortunately, she had a family emergency. She couldn't be here, but she wishes everyone best of luck. And actually, Nick was able to step in. We really appreciate Nick being able to do that at last minute. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about a couple of topics. I think I'm listing on this slide here. But first is, how the government is buying and evaluating and using SaaS. Then we're going to try to talk about value of the FedRAMP marketplace, purchasing FedRAMP versus not FedRAMP, and then kind of diving into PaaS versus IaaS versus SaaS offerings, just to see if there's any differentiation in the FedRAMP marketplace between the 3 that you guys want to dive into. I'm going to ask a couple questions to individual people, and then we're going to try to get some group think going on. So the first actually is to Justin. From your vantage point as acting CTO for the Department of the Navy, how do you navigate the complexities of procurement and implementing SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS solutions within the Department of Navy? And specifically, how does the FedRAMP standards and FedRAMP marketplace facilitate or constrain your technology strategy and operational efficiency?
Totally. Afternoon, Patriots. So 2 jobs. One is the CTO. So from a policy perspective, we could talk about cyber ready and the great work with Zero Trust and how that's being streamlined and making what's common, and riding off of some of the good stuff that's happening out of FedRAMP that made it worse. And then on the tech director for PEO Digital, so within the acquisition side where we're actually doing most of the procurement and acquisition and building for IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, we could talk about kind of those intersection points. So first piece is I met a couple of the folks here. Like if you're selling to the government, then you are part of the mission. You are serving. You are like aptly patriots, and you are probably frustrated just because it's annoying to do business with the government at times, right? And so where we can allow for focus, we want that, right? I'm a utility player, and I'd love nothing more than to just focus on being a good wide receiver or maybe tight end at this age. But the idea of like everyone having to be good at everything is something that we're trying desperately to get away from. And so the FedRAMP partnership has been imperfect, but a good one because it allows us to focus on what's common and then make use of that. So from a reciprocity perspective, we'll try and drive down that lane. And then from a cybersecurity and then specifically cyber ready initiative within the Department of Navy, the CIO and the CISO and I are all pushing this idea of moving continuous monitoring to the left. And so I think this opens up new doors. We right now have 2 pilots within cyber ready, and the way that we're evaluating pilots is the same way that we're going to, like, so the candidacy for pilots is the same way we're going to evaluate the effectiveness of those and scaling that process. And this is to say that if you are improving operational readiness and operational resilience, and so we can prove that with Zero Trust, we can say, hey, they have followed the process, but what's more important than the process is the results speak for themselves. And we have outcome-driven metrics. We have WAMs. There's a LinkedIn post and a couple other to tell how we do that and how we do that evaluation. We want that to be measured in things on the network that are effective, overall efficiencies of the folks who are using that, and then shifting the ratio of here's the amount of time doing technical work and here's the amount of time doing social work. So the answer to like how is that integration happening? Well, 6 months of mostly conversations in manual paperwork is unsatisfactory to everybody. So the more that we can automate that and in turn bring that down, the better off we are. If people are doing that well, we want to document that and we want to play more offense and share those stories. If people are particularly frustrated, be as specific as possible, and don't email me necessarily, but let's document the specifics of where we're hung up so that we can bin those and do something together. The coolest part of forums like this and in general where we are with the government is we talk to each other, and so in public, private, and all of it. So if we tee up, hey, here's a specific issue that we're saying we're doing well on and we aren't, and we're stuck, then we might be able to move the needle better than we could 5 years ago.
So that's Justin.Fanelli at Nathan. I'm just kidding.
Use that one.
Next is for James. Okay, in the context of cybersecurity compliance, can you discuss the value of selecting FedRAMP authorized solutions versus not FedRAMP one for OPM? And then how do those decisions align with the broader cybersecurity initiative and executive directives such as the EO on cybersecurity and EO 11.410 on secure use of AI?
Ooh, that's a long question. All right. I'd like to start off with saying that the vendors that choose into the FedRAMP marketplace, I know for a fact they take the government's cybersecurity interest seriously. Because you don't have to enter that marketplace. You can choose to serve private industry, nothing wrong with that. You can choose to work with the agency and find pathways around FedRAMP, which is a thing, unfortunately. So that's where I like to start off at. But when I think about, let's say, Executive Order 14028, for the most part, we're talking about Zero Trust, MFA, encryption, but in that same document, it speaks about supply chain. So when I think about FedRAMP, it helps me understand a bit more, hey, either the JAB has assessed this and say they're okay with it, or another agency has accepted, or we decide to sponsor a vendor, and we're assessing that so that we understand what's there. We understand if there's an issue, you're riding on whatever your IaaS provider is that you choose. If they're having an issue, then we know likely that you're inheriting that issue as well. And the last part is I really want to hit on is cost. As an agency, and OPM's a relatively small agency, the cost of security, we got to balance that with the business. So by going to FedRAMP, a majority of that cost is unfortunately or fortunately on the vendor. You have to invest in a pen test. You have to invest in a third-party assessment organization so that you can get your JAB authorization, agency authorization, et cetera. And on my end as a CISO, I don't have to expend my agency resources to go through all of your managed controls. I have to just focus on the customer managed ones. True, when I sign the ATO, we're assuming the risk across the entire stack. But it's really those three elements that, by being on the FedRAMP marketplace, it makes it easier for us to bring you on board. It makes it easier for us to contract with you, and it makes it easier for us to know where some of the risks lie versus just picking a vendor not on the FedRAMP marketplace.
Yeah, when I was a Fed myself at CMS, I had the pleasure of taking Databricks before they got their FedRAMP, the Howard's in the back there, through the ATO process and going through every single control line by line. So it was a super fun process. So I understand where you're coming from. Again, there's only so much time and energy that as a Fed, a federal civilian, that you can put toward trying to get a tool that you need for mission focus, into production. So FedRAMP is definitely important from that perspective. Nick, you have a unique vantage point because you were in the Obama administration when the FedRAMP program was being stood up, and then now you're on the other side of it with Insight Partners, looking at trying to move the needle forward through your companies, your portfolio companies there. So my question to you is, what are some of the things that have evolved in the world of FedRAMP since the early days of its inception to where you see it now on the other side?
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Great to be here. So we've made a lot of progress with FedRAMP in terms of the number of companies that have gone through. I think there's a greater understanding in the ecosystem. The whole purpose here is to have some standardization, and so to provide more options to these fine public servants. When it was getting stood up, I remember we had a 25-point cloud plan in 2009, I think, right? Mm-hmm. So as you think about this push to, we should do more cloud, the cloud can actually be safe, like those kinds of messages were coming out in the early part of the Obama administration. These days, there isn't this question about, whether we should move systems and build applications or buy SaaS. I think people understand that. Now there's this focus on how do we have greater efficiency, greater automation, right? The whole push for OSCAL, for example. So how do we think about this in terms of data rather than static documents?
Awesome. Yeah, and we'll be talking about OSCAL. I think Chris will be touching on that in the next session. And this one's for all of you. Could each of you elaborate on the strategic importance of the FedRAMP marketplace in your respective areas? So meaning, how does the platform streamline the procurement process of SaaS, IaaS, PaaS, if it does it all for you? And then what improvements would you like to see to better serve any federal agencies?
Yeah, I guess I'll start. I'll give an example. So right now we're looking for some additional security tools to support our mission. So I have the team, searching across the internet, looking at the Gartners and Forces of the world, scraping through Reddit forums, using ChatGPT as necessary, figure out what technologies can use to solve this particular situation we want to deal with. And they bring back a list. Fantastic. 50 items on this list. So I'll say, you all know my great filter is going to be, one, it needs to be a SaaS because I don't want to manage any infrastructure. And two, I really don't want to configure anything, so that kind of takes pass out the scenario. So of all the SaaSes on this list, which one needs actually FedRAMP? Oh, now it's about 3. So that right there was the great filter. Now we're these three we're actually going to actively engage with, do RFIs, RFPs, follow the process. Now it adheres to the security policy, which I'm enforcing for the agency. So from that perspective, that is how I use FedRAMP. We start with a mission need, filter it, and this is the universe that we get to work with. And as far as improvements, I think we touched on already OSCAL. Right now, the way that we implement risk management framework, particularly the authorization processes, is way too paper-based. and extremely human-based, where, you know, we have our developers and vendors, you know, you're pushing updates nearly in real time. And yet it's going to take one of my team members at least a week to say, yes, we can use this feature. So I think OSCAL, both from the FedRAMP perspective and agencies using it internally themselves, will probably be the biggest improvement that we can do in the interim.
You guys are all at companies and you started at some point. So how long did it take you to get a computer when you started at your company? Day one, right? So it takes us about 60 days. And so you just sit there angry for 60 days and then look for jobs on your phone. I'm kidding. So we're getting better. That was the old benchmark. Ready on day one was a big push that we had for our employees. And removing friction pays for itself over and over again from a compounding perspective. So FedRAMP Marketplace, we can talk about the hows, but specifically, we'll have won when you say it is as streamlined to work with the government as it is to work with industry. So you have dual use partners, and anything that you can do, because the innovation isn't necessarily coming from the government, to say, hey, this is a duplicative step, or this is super manual and I know how to automate that, bring that forward to the team and streamline it. Whenever one of Nick's startups within the portfolio of Insight Investments, and when your company and when some company that you're helping says, hey, I know that I have security on the public sector and private sector side, and there are times where private sector feels a little bit Wild West and standardization would be good, and there are times when government feels burdensome. And so where that is like in the same atmosphere and we're bringing that down and we can show that that is providing benefit, right? We don't want to go down to, I mean, it depends on the sector, right? Like Fin is pretty, you know, like they're doing things too. They're not Wild West. And so where we are benchmarking against realistic, highly secure industry partners and getting comparable results, and where an individual company is seeing those results and then bragging about it because you figured it out, share that. We'll make you, I don't know, like DoD famous. So tell those stories and make us all better at it. This is one of the most high leverage, or so one of like the longest pole vault opportunities we have in DoD and cloud, right? So like the 2009, we were super slow on cloud, and that was either like frustrating or like mildly like I don't know, validating if you're looking at the government and saying like, oh, you should be better. We can't afford to do that on AI and SaaS integrations, like really can't afford, like that we won't get the time back on cloud. This is a really important time to be as specific as possible for quantifying your ready on day one journey or ready on day 60 journey and any time that you save.
And Nick? I get a lot of calls from CEOs in our portfolio because we have hundreds of investments, and I only sit on 5 boards. So there's a lot of CEOs who I don't know very well in our portfolio because we'll have made a new investment, and they'll be like, what is this FedRAMP thing? And is this really required to sell in the federal government? And so I'll have this conversation about how increasingly it is required from a policy and from an action perspective. And increasingly, this is a best practice and an investment, but this is going to take you some dollars and some time. But I'll tell you what, if you're trying to hire a world-class VP of federal, that he or she is going to see whether you're committed to FedRAMP and to other federal certs to see if you're really committed to this marketplace. So there's kind of this question of, you know, are you committed as a SaaS company to the federal market, which includes certs. And so, you know, it's also useful because it's all public. You can say, look at your competitor. They're FedRAMP ready, or they have an authorization, and you can see that they're already making great progress. So it's a good, that's one of the, yes, how I actually use the marketplace. I use it in the education with CEOs and other executives inside the portfolio. Awesome.
So on that, if anyone does, so we occasionally hear like, oh, it costs it's $1 million investment, it's a $2 million investment, it's a 1 year. If anyone does that faster or cheaper, then we will brag for you on that, and we will kind of like raise that up. You can email me. That's David Maskeroni. Let's lift that up.
That's how, you can get into that faster lane, I'm just saying. It was actually interesting to hear, Nick, I'm actually curious, and we don't have to talk about it now, but at what point in the journey when you're talking with them, do you say, when are you going to take this seriously? I guess it's probably company by company dependent on when they're going to do that. And then we can hit on that later. For Justin, you said the federal government can be burdensome sometimes. I think there's never going to be burdensome. It's more methodical and thought provoking. And then
wait. So the government is not burdensome. We're getting real and getting better.
Yeah.
So getting real. Can we do a quick vote on that?
I'd be curious to see. And then James, actually, I do have a question that we can touch on real quick. When you say that when you do your filter down on the FedRAMP lens, is that just FedRAMP approved, or do you also consider those who are in process or those who have FedRAMP ready? Like where does that filter end for you?
I'll say it the simplest way. If you exist on the marketplace, you count. So ready works, accepted works, and progress works.
Okay. Justin, how does the Department of the Navy approach the challenge of integrating SaaS with existing PaaS and IaaS infrastructures while adhering to federal mandates and ensuring operational readiness and security?
So we have different use cases, and so like the level of delegated authority depends on the particular use case. Mm-hmm. And so that we have use case 1, 2, and 3. And so the process for evaluating that right now is an assumption that we revisit from time to time, and I think results will dictate revisiting that, the better that goes. And so I was talking about the cyber ready pilots. For the cyber ready pilots, the idea of continuously monitoring those and automating more of that means that we can streamline that. Yeah. Less manual, less governance, less checks. In general, one of the primary ways that we do this within PEO Digital is we say, okay, first, what is the value or the impact of this service to the greater good, right? And so like there will never, I hope, be a shortage of SaaS applications that are good, dual use case. They've proven that, but like they understand our environment well enough to show that they will be at highest impact. We are prioritizing based on impact and value. From there, we say, okay, this is highest impact, but it's a little bit clunkier. This will be hard. This might be a use case 3, in which case we're going to hustle and do attention. But the more of that can be in the background, or the more that we can quantify the case for why this is important, and then we drill into those standard questions, the better it is. If we don't understand what this is doing, or if it's just a pilot for pilot's sake, then we can't say this is going to help Indo-PACOM, so we need to get this through, or let's break out for a 30-minute meeting with this AO. Right. So that the numerator-denominator distinction, and frankly, the vendors and the operational users are driving that and pushing the acquisition folks and the policy folks. And so that's, I think, the way it should be, because there's almost cycles there.
Yeah, I agree. There's an aspect of this that people don't recognize when they come into it from the private industry, that the acquisitions team is very much they need to be part of the process and ensuring that you're getting effective mission-ready applications into production. James, with a focus on securing sensitive information, how does OPM evaluate the security offerings of, you said you don't do PaaS and IaaS, I'm going to take that out, but of the SaaS tools that you're pulling from the FedRAMP marketplace? And then how do you ensure these services continually meet the evolving threats and compliance requirements that are changing?
Oh, well, we definitely do use IaaS and PaaS. I just personally prefer SaaS just to reduce the burden on myself and my
got you.
But I don't think this process differs too much than how we do risk management across any system. Yep. So it starts with understanding the business or mission need. What does this program office need? What does my counterpart in OCIO need? Second is then understanding the data. The sensitive information is very broad. Some data is more sensitive than others, mm-hmm. which then will force us to look into, hey, this data is truly sensitive. Think PHI, PII, information about federal employees. Well, that's pretty much going to pitch you in the FedRAMP high boundary, which is a filter in itself. Or maybe it's a different type of data, maybe project management data or financial data, and maybe it goes moderate and then other data goes low. So depending on data, we'll say, hey, program office, business partner, we're likely going to rate you as a FIPS 199 high, which means any cloud provider that you're looking for will need to be at the high rating. Now, last time I looked I looked at the marketplace earlier this week. There's quite a few high SaaS providers out there, a little less PaaS, and naturally there's only so many IaaS providers. But in some cases, when you go IaaS, that's where you're going to find your highs. So you may have to build on top of that versus finding a SaaS provider. As far as continuously monitoring, it's the monthly comm-outs. I think you mentioned that earlier in the intro. That's probably the best place for you and other agencies that are leveraging the particular platform to be able to interact with the vendor to identify weaknesses, issues, problems, vulnerabilities, et cetera, so that you can address them, so that you can figure out, what risks are you inheriting, so that you can now make a risk-based decision. Hey, this vendor, for whatever reason, isn't necessarily holding up the end of the bargain. I may need to go a different direction. Or this vendor's doing great. I want to do more business with them. Anything else we can FedRAMP with you? That kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Nick, from a policy and advisory perspective, how do you see the role of FedRAMP and the FedRAMP marketplace evolving to better support the government's needs for flexible, secure, and efficient cloud services across PaaS, SaaS, and IaaS?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because I've been asked that several times with the federal government and submitted comments and talked to folks. In fact, John Allison, who's been now in several portfolio companies, is one of our resident experts on FedRAMP and has also submitted a lot of thoughts here. At the end of the day, I'll revert to what I said earlier, is that we have to go faster, right? What was the stat today? 500 companies, more give or take, right? Yeah. And so how many software companies do you think the federal government uses today? More than 500, right? It's got to be thousands, if not tens of thousands. And so, how do we step change this? Across subsequent administrations, we've decided that this is going to be how we do security once. And then, so we got to drive real reciprocity. We've got to drive real automation. And so one of the ways to do that, in my mind anyway, is to remove sponsorship. Because right now we have John's cheering. We have a single threaded process. That is, it's got to go through your consultant, it's got to go through 3PAO, it's got to go through your customer, and then it's got to go through a PMO. And so each of these has humans making subjective decisions, right? So this isn't binary. It's like, well, no, I think the boundary should be like this, or I think this piece of evidence qualifies for that. So there's some subjectivity in all of these steps, and you fundamentally have to go through a single program office. And this is the same thing is true with DISA, and so on the DoD side. And so what if we were to remove the sponsorship and essentially accredit some sort of standards enforcement? And that's the way most private sector standards work, is you have standards bodies that do that function for the government. And I think that would actually help us get, along with some of the automation that we're pursuing as a community, I think that would help us get there faster, because we really want to get more companies up to that security bar. And I'm all for the kinds of improvements in security that FedRAMP represents, because there's always this tension of, for startups and for scale-ups, should I just do what's required of FedRAMP, or should I actually take this holistically across my entire product and company? And I'm glad that a lot of the CEOs that I talk with and CISOs inside of my companies that I talk with want to do the latter. That is, they actually want to make this corporate-wide. But the fact of the matter is we're still only at 500 companies, and we've got to go faster. So I think removing sponsorship would be a pretty big change, but would help us get there. And that's going to require Congress and OMB. That's not something that the program office can do unilaterally. The second thing that I think would be really big is better reciprocity and DISA or DoD and the federal civilian or the program office, because right now we have reciprocity from FedRAMP moderate to IL2, but you basically have a lot of additional process steps inside of DoD. And if you actually go ask this, well, how many SaaS companies are actually at IL4, IL5, IL6? You quickly get very few, right? I think it's like teams that are IL4 of SaaS companies. And so what does that tell you? That there's only a dozen SaaS companies that DoD feels comfortable using? No, of course they're using it. They're just not going through the IL process through DISA, right? And so I think we could have greater reciprocity and greater standardization between the federal civilian and defense side of this.
Can we start the petition today? Well, I'll sign it. I'll be the first signer. You can get that signature going to get that removed. Because again, it is chicken or the egg for some folks, especially when you're starting out and you have an amazing product, but you don't have the connection. That's really hard to get that sponsorship. You can go for FedRAMP ready, but it's a challenge when you're doing that too.
Can I say one more quick thing?
Yeah.
Is that we're seeing that FedRAMP is valuable outside of government. That is in regulated industries, in state government, et cetera. The fact that you've achieved FedRAMP actually means something, especially if you've taken it seriously as a company and applied it corporate-wide to your products rather than a separated federal one.
Good point.
So riffing off of that, like lowering the burden, the only way to do that, we can like root for the policy or influence them. But like if we have the numbers that show and a few stories that show that we have opened up the market. So there are some IL4 and IL5, like there are fewer IL6, but commercial solutions for classified is something that we want to do more of. I was looking at we had a meeting this morning on this. And so the idea of opening up that market is lowering the burden, looking for these win-wins, mostly likely through automation, where you could do a stepwise change, where then you could say we don't need a sponsor because our throughput is there. And so it's a matter of speed, like Nick said, and then lowering the burden because the amount of investment has to come down to do that speed anyway. So that's very much a win-win. Like that trade space is connected.
Yeah, I agree. In the interest of time, now because we're talking about like what we would change, James, I'm just going to get you. What would you change the most? What would have the most impact for you to change low-hanging fruit?
I was just sitting here going to my thoughts on the comment earlier about removing the sponsorships, and I was like, how could that work? And my thoughts were settled. Police don't know, by the way. I'm sure you have noticed that. Is a lot of the vendors has no SOC 1, 2. For financial area, you have PCI, DSS, and other forms of PCI, and other equivalent accreditation. So maybe just me crystal balling here. Don't hold me to this or anything. I'm not part of the FedRAMP organization, but maybe some type of reciprocity between standard industry accreditations and FedRAMP. So if you achieve 1, 2 of pick your accreditation, that is equal to a low or moderate FedRAMP, maybe. So that's me throwing out there. Don't hold me to it.
I mean, it would be a good solution too. We have 10 minutes left, so I want to open it up for questions. I'm sure there are going to be a ton. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. We'll have a microphone come to you. Don't ask it before you have the microphone for the sake of those who are remote. We have some questions here. Go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity to ask the question to all the panelists, even though Nick is the one that brought the idea of lowering the burden for the assessment process. Does it, and reciprocity having in place, does it make sense maybe to employ a different process that will allow for level 1, level 2 self-assessment versus higher levels that will employ a third-party assessment? Would that be another direction to go? What do you think would that be?
I think there's a value. I'll start. So I think there's a value to having third parties, right? When you have an accountant or when you have an auditor, right? And all the companies where I'm on the board, we have an independent auditor, and they present a report that we see, and they say, hey, the financial controls were weak here, or et cetera, and we insist on an annual audit. So having third parties come in, I think is actually valuable. I think that's a good kind of security practice. I think it's a good corporate governance practice. And the question is, in my mind, do you need the government to be actively playing a role there, or can we have some sort of accredit the standards bodies rather than directly sign off on those?
The reason why I ask question is because from a low risk from the IRS perspective, I can use any tax software, and I'm confident that I do a good job because I have good guidance. It has automation in place. Maybe OSCAL can help for lower L1, L2, L3 systems to support a faster process through self-assessment with rigorous criteria, of course.
I'm all for fast.
While you're trying to simplify, shouldn't you also try to duplicate? Now we also have CMMC, right? So you're talking about removing the sponsor. What if you take the assessment of CMMC to bring that company up to a certain level as far as the identification of a secure provider? They may not already be FedRAMP ready, but you know they've already gone through a pretty rigorous inspection, which is also pretty hard for a small business to get through already.
No, don't get me started on CMMC.
Yeah, I think that's something to that one really quick. I can see self-assessments up to the FedRAMP low marker, but when we start getting to moderate and high, that normally involves more and more sensitive data. So even if I were to receive a self-assessment, I'm going to still, either through my direct agency resources or actually as a vendor, to still do a pen test, still provide actual facts and evidence and artifacts in order to actually assure that self-assessment, so you can fill it out and say, I'm an A student across the board, but when a third party or your own internal teams actually take a look at it and say, all right, well, maybe we're seeing this subject, we can work on this. So that will be my initial concern if we go a self-assessment route, anything above low. Yeah.
Hi, Sam Idlet, 38 North Security. So my question is for everyone, but Justin, you had mentioned shifting left for ConMon, and I have a lot of thoughts on how that can be done on the industry side and automating ConMon and things like that, especially with container guidance and, you don't have to scan production anymore type stuff. From the government side, though, what's your thoughts on deliverables and how we can shift left and validate continuous monitoring deliverables, and potentially not have to have such intrusive scanning in production, leveraging things like CI/CD, staging environments?
For it? So in general, the artifacts that come out of CI/CD are what's that?
SaaS.
Like they can be rich. And so if we can do more quickly, one-time reconciliation between an artifact spec and what's coming out of those and say, hey, this is meeting the mark, that's something that saves 1,000 different groups time, right? And so that reconciliation once, based on, so that's a little bit of process, right? But based on outcomes, right? We have had some success on looking at something and then pressing, I believe, but this is in Horizon 2, putting it through, monitoring it and say, well, the outcomes suggest that this is working. Let's step that up in terms of scale. And you can do that quickly, right? We're doing 30-day pilots, 60-day pilots to do that. So, it's a great idea. And if you prove something and then share it with everybody, that success story, David Maskeroni.
Aquia.us.
I had a question. There's a big focus on better, cheaper, faster, obviously because it's cumbersome and costly and time consuming to go through FedRAMP. But at the same time, there's opening the door of self-attestation, which we saw kind of failed abysmally among the defense industrial base due to false attestations and so on. How do we kind of balance that dichotomy of better, cheaper, faster when we look at the LPTA paradigm? Are we going to get more insecure, less governance, less rigor? How do we, there's a lot of companies that are very mature, have FedRAMP and are being breached and impacting the federal government, Department of Defense, and so on. How do we open that door without, exposing ourselves to a lot of risk due to lowering the barrier and the governance and the rigor and so on?
I'll start. So better, cheaper, faster, several of those are inputs. right? And so like cheaper is an input, faster can be an input, it can also be an output. Better is like a little bit generic, right? And so if we're looking at the outcomes as a result of this process and revisiting that, then I think it allows you to make value-based decisions as opposed to like just pure cost-based decisions. And so there's nuance in there, but where we have like quantitative, hey, this is, and think a little bit bigger, like this is 10 times faster. Like we are doing this much, much better. That plus some of the zero trust specifics allow us to pilot 5, 10 different COAs and show that one is a far better option than others. And then we can simplify it and genericize the language. But I think there are probably different definitions for every seat in the room on faster, better, cheaper. If we say what we mean, we standardize, and then we can get everyone in the cyber apparatus to kind of nod to that, then reciprocity gets way easier.
Let's also think about the alternative of complex custom built and then maintained software, which is kind of arguably the dominant way that the systems are built and maintained in government, right? And so SaaS can be better, faster, cheaper compared to that.
And I want to add to that, even though we want to accelerate and make the checks, cheaper, it's still going through the same process, still doing the same checks, still pretty much being up against 853. When I think about it, and ATO's code, CI/CD pipelines is really, again, accelerated it, but you're still hitting the same checks. So where we could work on reducing risk as far as breaches and threats, it's improving, as mentioned, the outcomes, the targets that we're looking for. But I don't think that's necessarily fully coupled with being better, cheaper, faster.
We have time for one more question.
Good afternoon, Shantae Singletary from CMS. So I really like that idea of removing the sponsorship, which is interesting. And then I think, James, you mentioned looking at some outside audits as a consideration of rubber stamping. So if you think about it, and I'm just putting this out there, if most of these companies go through a 3PL or some type of audit firm, right? And they've already been accredited through FedRAMP or to do SOC 2s or PCI DSS. Wouldn't that be nice if we can just use those assessments as just a way of bringing some of these SaaS products in the fold with FedRAMP? I'm just throwing it out there as an idea, because a lot of the controls that you look at different frameworks, they all map to the same requirements. So a lot of these organizations may not adhere to NIST 853, but maybe they're ISO 27001. They crosswalk with each other. So if I'm an organization that's already been to an audit, can an organization leverage some of those audit results to become FedRAMP or more FedRAMP ready? Just a consideration out there. It's something that our agency has been looking at for a while, because FedRAMP does not move at the speed of light. And we have centers and offices that really want to use other products, and the marketplace is limited. And as you all know, most of these FedRAMP products, there's multiple variations in the non-FedRAMP realm of things. It may offer a different pricing model. So that's another challenge, right? So I think we just got to figure out a different way of doing things. And I'm really interested in hearing some of you guys' feedback on that.
As the non-Fed, I can probably say that I'd like us to also take these kinds of approaches. I think it's all the above. I think we can find ways to strengthen and improve FedRAMP while also thinking about SOC 2, which has a lot of the same controls. How can you get going on using that for mission if the risk is suitably low, right? If it's at the right level, because there are so many great software companies and capabilities out there that the federal mission absolutely needs to take advantage of. Because there's the risk of, well, what if we don't adopt some of these tools? We're going to under-deliver on mission. We are perhaps not going to give the warfighter everything that he or she needs. Like there is operational risk we're taking by not adopting emerging state-of-the-art technology. So I think we have to be thinking about that risk too. So CMS has led on the, hey, let's think about alternative approaches while we're also trying to get companies through FedRAMP as well. So I appreciate the all the above approach.
Justin or James, any thoughts?
I guess my first thought is, I am beholden to follow agency policy and federal policy. So whatever FedRAMP is right now is what I'll follow. But I like the idea. It actually makes a lot of sense. Probably had to do a crosswalk between, the deltas between the various different ones. But from my old studies, they're about 80-90% the same, right? So that last 10%, how much value do those last 10% of controls matter? Are they documentation controls, -1 controls, or are they something else? So I think that might be something really good to look into in the future. So I may have to put a bug into GSA 0 one of these days on that subject.
There you go.
Acceptable to the agency, because really I'm not getting pen test scans vulnerability scans or pen test results. I'm really understanding their security program and whether or not it meets the level of NIST 853. So that's the comfort I get. Like if you go into any type of grocery store, they meet a certain standard, right? Accreditation. Any organization meets a level of accreditation. I want to make sure that level of accreditation exists with that vendor. They're doing their security best practices and due diligence. They have an established program that wouldn't ultimately impact me in any kind of way, right? The other stuff I would have to figure out down the line. I think that's something we can have further conversations around. But if they already did some initial stuff, why can't that be leveraged?
Yep. And so, for me, this is like a macro optimization problem, right? And so would this save more time than going, so do the translation conversations take more time than re-due diligencing it, right? And I think if you look at the whole, and we're super organized about that, if it opens the market, if the thing we're optimizing for here is not maintaining a risk posture, but looking at overall risk and looking at cost to users and looking at the size of the ecosystem, so panning out, I think there's a real return on investment to those bigger ideas. But where it comes from and who funds that, do we put that into the POM, or do people just initiate ideas that say, hey, we did this translation and this is something that other people can do over and over again? It's pretty finite. There are only so many translations. So the Rosetta Stone is 3, 4, 5 languages max. Yeah. I think we can prove that out.
Yeah, I think there's room for cross-agency collaboration on these things. Certainly that was the intent of the FedRAMP program in the beginning anyway, was to create a standard. But as we're seeing, the speed of business and the mission moves a little bit faster than that program. So it's not going to get solved here today, but these are definitely thought-provoking things. I want to thank all of you for joining us on this panel. It's been a pleasure talking with all three of you.